If you've got a Bible, we're going to transition to a new sermon series in the book of Habakkuk. And if that one's not on the tip of your tongue, start at the New Testament and then go backwards. It's right towards the end of the Old, and it's only a couple of pages long. So you might want to throw in your table of contents to find Habakkuk. That's where we're going to be for the next 3 weeks. We're calling the sermon series Living in Troubled Times. You'll see why in just a second, but the book of Habakkuk is one of the prophets. He's called a minor prophet because he was succinct. He wrote only 3 chapters, and minor means small, not insignificant. And during the season of Advent, we often look at the prophets in particular because those prophets help us wait and long for and reignite the preparation posture of waiting for Jesus to show up, because that's what they were all about when they were writing. And so for the next 3 weeks, if you've never read this letter before, if you've never read this book, I'm excited for you to experience it for the first time. And if you have, you know the journey that we're about to go on is a rich one. So I'm going to read chapter 1 from Habakkuk, and this will be God's word to us this morning. Habakkuk chapter 1 reads like this: The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There's strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if I told you. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They're a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities, but by building earthen ramps to capture them. And then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You can't tolerate wrongdoing. So why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You've made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net and gathers them up in his drag net, and then he rejoices and is glad. And he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his drag net, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? Lord, we commit this reading and hearing of your word into your hands. You promised even the weird parts of the Bible are the means by which you speak and act in our lives. And so, Lord, we ask that you would do just that. As we learn to wait, as we embrace preparing, help us to do it following the ways of Habakkuk. In Jesus' name, amen. I need to begin with a bit of confession. I've got a love-hate relationship with joining people for dinner for the first time. I don't know if you've ever done this before, and this is a bit of a confession because I know it's not right, but love-hate relationship, joining people for dinner for the first time. Love because I love people. I'm fairly extroverted. I like hearing stories and coming into people's houses and seeing pictures and pets and just having a great time. The hate part of the relationship is that I'm a little weird when it comes to food. I grew up as a picky eater and a family that was like Southern Georgia culture where we planned dinner eating breakfast. Like we're those people. And I've learned that is not something that every family shares. Like that's just not the same set of priorities that people have. And so when I come to somebody's house, I'm just always a little bit suspicious of like, what's the vibe gonna be? Like, are we gonna eat? Or are we gonna like finger food this? Is it gonna be late? Is it gonna be early? Like, how is this gonna go? And one particular instance, I remember I was eating for the first time with my wife's extended family, with one of her aunts, and it was Thanksgiving. So we get up early, and we were told the game plan was get up, drive to the aunt's house, and then we would eat Thanksgiving meal and then come home. Perfect. Like, I'm a little angsty, but like Kendra knows me well enough at this point. She's got my vibe. We're good. So I get up, and I asked Kendra, are we eating breakfast here? And she said no. And in my mind, it went without question that meant I would be eating breakfast when I arrived at Aunt Susie's house, and that was not the case. We drove for about 2 hours, and I got there expecting to like smell bacon, and then realized I wasn't. Now I've got enough restraint to like talk myself off that ledge. Like, okay, you made a mistake, you made an assumption, you should have brought a Cliff Bar, but just hang in there. Like, not everybody is a breakfast eater. You're okay, Tim. This is family. You can engage, you can connect, you can drink some coffee. It's fine. And so we get the first few hours of family bonding in there. Everybody is preparing for the Thanksgiving lunch that we're going to eat, which is going to be delightful. And then I look at the clock, and like 11:30 rolls around, and I've been up for a minute, right? I'm kind of feeling it. And then like 12 o'clock rolls around, and it doesn't seem like we're close to serving. And so I kind of quietly look at Kendra, and I'll say, okay, how long until, not trying to rush, everybody's got stuff to do, how long until we're eating lunch? And she says, I don't know. I don't know. Okay, all right, we're going to come, we're going to talk, we're going to connect. It's going to be great. It's family. I love these people. They love me. 1 o'clock comes around. Kendra, hold on. How long? I'm just checking. And then Kendra sees my angst and goes to talk with her aunt, comes back out, maybe by 2. Oh. So 2 o'clock comes around. We're still not fully prepared. But mercifully, the aunt is sensing my anxiety, and she's like, well, hey, I made a mistake earlier in the day and like kind of overcooked these croissants, but I'm making fresh ones. But if anybody just needs a little tie over until we eat lunch. And so there is a 2:15 p.m. and Kendra's family, has priorities of connecting with loved ones and enjoying the holiday together. I'm over in the corner, angry eating burnt croissants, because that's where I am. And in my head, I'm muttering to myself, why is this the situation? Like, my justice alarms are going off. Like, how do you not know that by 2 o'clock people should be eating food? Like, I felt that in my soul. Now, I hope that you're laughing at me, because I was clearly the one in the wrong, not the family. But there's a progression, and maybe you've done this progression before. When you're in a situation that you don't want to be in, the first question we tend to ask is, how long do I have to put up with this? Right? If it's only for a minute or two, you're fine. You kind of like grin and bear it and move on. But the longer you're in that situation that you don't want to be in, the more how long becomes why. Right? The more that the like, how long do I have to wait becomes a, why am I have to be here in the first place? Who did something wrong to make me have to be the one suffering for their mistakes? I felt that on Thanksgiving, and it's kind of funny. Habakkuk felt it in a much more profound way. If you don't know any context about the Old Testament, this back and forth between Habakkuk and God is not going to make a lick of sense. But in the first 2 verses of this letter, Habakkuk asks 2 questions. How long am I going to have to deal with what I'm dealing with, God? And by the way, why am I the one that's having to deal with this? So we've got a sense that whatever is going on is something that's difficult, troubling, that Habakkuk doesn't want to be putting up with, and he's been putting up with it for longer than a minute, such that he has pivoted from just asking how long to why is this happening in the first place. We're calling this sermon series Troubled Times, because the book of Habakkuk is written to a group of people that are finding themselves in troubled times often. And it's a unique prophet, because most of the time when you're reading the prophets, it's a teacher addressing God's people. And he's writing in a way that's instructive. It's didactic. It's here's what you need to do, here's what you need to think. In this letter, it is entirely an individual wrestling with God in prayer. Habakkuk, we don't know much. We know that he was a prophet, so he would work at the temple, and then he was also the worship leader at the temple. So he would play the ancient Near Eastern version of the guitar and lead them in song. And so you're going to see in this letter 2 chapters worth of praying and 1 chapter worth of singing, and all of it is him trying to figure out, how do I navigate this environment that I don't want to be in? And the context that is going on, we get clues later, is a context where the country of Israel was a disaster. Right? You saw it in the first couple of verses. How long do I have to cry out to you violence, but you don't save? You make me look at injustice, tolerate wrongdoing. There's a culture around Habakkuk that's filled with things that shouldn't be happening, a sense of destruction, a sense of violence, a sense of frivolous and malicious lawsuits. There's all sorts of things written in these first few verses that Habakkuk is trying to say. It feels like the fabric of the country is falling apart. The culture in which I find myself in is not doing well. This isn't a moral, upstanding group of people that I'm living in the midst of, and I'm tired of it. For much of our history in the U.S., there's some sense for some of us where we felt like life was pretty good. Some of us, not so much. And so there's a difference when it talks about your view of the surrounding culture, not just your own individual life, but for the last several decades, it was a mixed bag on whether you thought you were living in good times or bad times. Was the economy stable? Did I have a job? Did I feel like I had a sense of progress moving forward? Anymore, over the last couple of years, you've noticed the cultural tone. Regardless of your political perspective, regardless of your moral definitions, it feels like we increasingly view the times in which we are in as bad times, as hard times, as difficult times. We have different reasons for it. But we don't enjoy the cultural moment in which we find ourselves in. And what Habakkuk is wrestling with individually is that realization. What happens when we start asking God, how long? And why is this going on in the first place? So we're going to go on a journey with Habakkuk. And the first thing that we're going to see in this journey is that before God sort of answers and instructs and counsels Habakkuk, he actually Habakkuk guides this experience by drilling into the heart of the problem. If we're still fuzzy on what troubled times means, what exactly are we talking about, and what does that actually look like in day-to-day life? Habakkuk gets to it. He lists a ton of symptoms. So there's destruction and violence and strife and conflict, but they're all somewhat vague, and they don't make a lot of sense out of context. But then he says, here's the bottom line, verse 4, therefore the law is paralyzed. And when the law is paralyzed, justice never prevails, the wicked hem in the righteous, and justice is perverted. So the story of God's people in the Old Testament is that they were rescued out of a foreign, oppressive, enslaving country. And they were given this thing called Torah. It was a Hebrew word for law. And it had 3 components. There's going to be a moral component, definitions of what's right, wrong, and best. There's going to be a civic component. You're actually got to be a culture, a society, a governance. We're going to talk about property and taxes and all that. And then there's going to be a worship, a temple, a cultic component of how you function with sacrifices and who does what. And part of the reason, by the way, that it's hard to read the Old Testament is they don't label the 3. So you kind of ebb and flow on all 3 types of law. And another story for another time is how we read that on the other side of Jesus. But back in the day, all 3 were prescriptive. They were meant to be followed by the letter. And if you did, the intent of the law was to create this beautifully distinct group of people. God said, if you follow these ways, I'm going to bless you. And as I bless you, you're going to be a blessing to other people. If you live inside these boundaries and function according to these principles, people are going to notice. You're going to be counterculturally generous to the poor and the widow and the orphan. You're going to be uniquely striking in resting for one day a week at a time when slavery was so common and nobody rested. You're going to have one God and have an intimate relationship with that God, not have to worry about pleasing like 1,000 of them that are constantly mad. If you live into these ways, you will look uniquely beautiful to your surrounding culture. And the story of the Old Testament is over time, people got less and less enthralled with having that law imposed on them, such that it became so bad, they actually lost all written records of what that law was. Imagine a society progressing so far that we can no longer find a Bible. It got that distant. And there's a story by a name, or of a name of Josiah. Josiah was one of the kings. This is like history to build you up to this, okay? Josiah was one of the kings, and he actually was like walking through the temple one day and like kicked over something and discovered the written copy of the Bible. He was like, what's this? And as he read it, it was the book of Deuteronomy, and this sweeping beauty started to come throughout the nation again, and they started to live into these ways, and they started to be distinct again, and everything was working harmoniously until Josiah got killed in a battle with Egypt, and his son took over, and his son is the guy that is currently the king when Habakkuk is writing. And Habakkuk is saying, we used to have this beauty, we used to have this law, we used to have this invitation, and Josiah's kid looked at all of it and was like, nope, not going to do that. And because the law is still there, we haven't lost it. I can read it. There's people that want to follow it, but the majority of the country is following that guy, not this book. So he's saying the law isn't gone, it's just functionally powerless. It's paralyzed. And troubled times, by definition for Habakkuk, is a time when the law, the beautiful ways of God, are still there, but they're not effective. There's no way for somebody who's in the minority, Habakkuk, to appeal to a rules standard, right? And this is something we got to get. As Christians, when we're living in troubled times, we have to remember this. It's tough to remember, but law and rules alone can't make things right. Sometimes we're tempted to think that. Like, if I see something that's wrong, I need to create the rule to make it right, and then everything's going to be fine because I created the rule, right? As a parent, I want that to be the case. I tell my son, do not hit your sisters. He's 2, they're 1, and the rule is there. He doesn't follow it. Right? But the rule is clear. He understands it. He'll even say it back. Caleb, do you bite daddy? No bite daddy. Okay, did you just bite daddy? Yes, I just bit daddy. Right? The rule is there, but he doesn't follow it. And rules alone, Habakkuk says, aren't enough. There was a sense where he was lamenting this, and a sense where he was saying, when we lose a common submission to an outside rule, it just becomes a way of whoever is bigger and badder imposing their will. Did you hear it in the passage? He says in verse 4, therefore the law is paralyzed, it's no longer followed, so justice doesn't prevail, God's ways don't come forward. The ones who suffer when we don't have a common law are the oppressed. Injustice starts to creep up. Why? Because in the next verses, the wicked hem in, they outnumber, they crowd in the righteous. The ones who are not following the law begin to outnumber and become the majority of the ones who want to follow the law. And then it says, justice is twisted. It's perverted. Whoever is in charge, whoever has the most influence, gets to decide what's right, wrong, and best. If you have seen this in the history of our country, just sort of like a political example, right? In the 1920s, we decided that alcohol was going to be illegal, prohibition, right? So we passed the amendment, we made it illegal, and because we made it illegal, and because there was a rule, nobody drank, right? How'd that go? Most would actually say it became the forbidden fruit. We increased alcohol consumption and also gave birth to something called organized crime, mob bosses and bootleggers. And then we realized this is actually a law that the people don't want, and so we gave up on it, and we have the 21st Amendment. I'm not trying to get political theory on whatever your view is on alcohol or not, but what I want you to see in the principle is there was a rule, and the people said, not going to do it. And so then the rule became functionally worthless, and then we changed our definition of what was right and wrong to fit the majority view. It can happen in any kind of dynamic. And what Habakkuk is saying is troubled times come when we have a majority of people who are just making it up on their own. God's people should be following God's ways, but they're just creating their own selective adaptation. So the king sees we should be taking care of those in poverty, and yet, Jehoiakim was his name, he would manipulate the poor, underpay them, and then build a more comfortable palace. He had the Bible, he had the law, but he decided when he would selectively follow it or not. Now, in a modern culture like ours, what we typically get here at this point is, well, the problem is when we try and enforce our own view of morality on somebody else, right? You've heard this before. Whenever we get into these kinds of conversations, we'll all be better served if we just let people determine what's right, wrong, and best for themselves, rather than just might makes right and imposing our view out of sheer force on somebody else. Just stop. Everybody stop trying to do that. Everybody give everybody permission to do their own thing, and if we do, we'll all be fine. Right? We've heard that before. We read these verses and we think, well, that was Jehoiachin's problem. He was twisting justice and trying to impose his own view as king. He was being too authoritative. That was the issue. Let me suggest a couple of things. If this is your view, just kind of let everybody do their own thing and we'll all be fine. I want to be respectful, but I want to poke at it a little bit. Ask you a couple of questions. Where does your view of right and wrong come from? All of us. If it's everybody for themselves, it's a gut level instinct, right? It's just an intuition of what we feel like is right and wrong. And as long as we're not hurting anybody, we should just give everybody permission to do it. The problem is we're all inconsistent with applying that principle. Perfect example is what's going on in Gaza right now. Right? Now we can have moral clarity as Christians about what's going on in Gaza right now, and that's a different sermon for a different time on what is going on. I would encourage you, if you haven't read or researched The Bulletin by Christianity Today, it will help you think theologically through that quagmire. It's really, really well researched. Would encourage you to check that out. But what you've noticed culturally is that not everybody views what's going on in Gaza in the same way. There are some folks that I think rightly would say Hamas isn't good for anybody, Palestine or Israel. And there are terrorist acts that are unspeakably evil that are happening. And we need to get rid of Hamas. Justice is the eradication of terrorism. That is the definition of what should happen. And so we wanted to try and figure out how the best way of making that happen with as minimal damage to human life as possible. And then there's an entirely different group of people. You've seen it. A lot on college campuses, even protests in New York, where they're actually celebrating the paragliders of Hamas coming into Israel. What is that? Those are two different entire definitions of what's right and wrong, of what's just and unjust. Some would view the entire issue as the complete opposite, where it's actually Israel's fault, and this is the natural progression of an oppressed people trying to fight back. Now, we can have a dialogue and talk through moral clarity. Again, I'm not picking sides in this sermon. I've hinted at where I think we should be as Christians. But what I'm telling you is, what do you do when you have people who completely disagree on their definition of justice? All of us instinctually say, well, they're wrong. Right? Don't we do that? We say like, no, everybody for themselves, but you have to bend to mine. And what this passage is saying is we can try and pretend like we don't need an objective law that everybody has to submit to. We can try and pretend like we don't need something that's universally applicable to every single human, that's universally defining of what's right, wrong, and best. But instinctually, we can't get away from it. Just to make sure that we don't lose each other, I do think we need moral clarity with Hamas as a terrorist organization. So I'm using this as an illustration. Don't miss what I'm trying to say. Okay. But troubled times come when we lose a common agreed upon sense of what's right and wrong, and then we start to spar over competing definitions of justice. Now, all of a sudden, Habakkuk feels a little bit less like this weird thing that Tim read at 10 a.m. on a Sunday and starts to feel like a conversation that we had over coffee last week. What do we do when we're living in a culture and in a moment when we can't even agree on what's right and wrong, on what's just and unjust, and we start to compete with each other and wage war with each other and fight with each other? How long do we have to deal with that? If it's for a year, fine. But if it's for 10 years, if it's for 15 years, if it starts getting worse, but without it getting better, don't you start to cry out? Why is this happening? Didn't we used to have a better way of life? Didn't we used to have a more common agreed upon sense of morality? God, why are we living in times like this? What are you going to do about it? Advent is a time to touch back in with those questions. It's an invitation to be a little more honest with the world in which we find ourselves in. If you're not currently asking how long or why, then what Habakkuk would encourage you to do is dig a little deeper and say, well, what's going on that those questions feel foreign? It could be that those questions feel offensive. Habakkuk's being pretty bold and blatant with God. He's arguing, borderline accusing God. He's kind of rage praying right now. If that feels a little bit too irreverent, then maybe your definitions of connecting with God are different than the Bible's. Because this is a prophecy given to us on how to connect with God. It's okay to ask those hard questions. In fact, it's encouraged, especially in a season of Advent. Does your prayer life regularly, especially during a season like this, look around and give yourself permission to say, how long? How long are we going to deal with death? How long are we going to deal with cancer? How long are we going to deal with a culture of selfishness? How long are we going to deal with a complete myopic focus on self? How long? And why? Why does it have to be like that? What's going on? And we cry out to God. Let Habakkuk encourage you to see the troubled times we live in as when we lose sight of the law, when it becomes paralyzed. And then we begin to process and to pray. Now, there's a big difference between how could you, God, and how could God. If I said, how could you allow this? I'm connecting with you in relationship. If I say, how could God do this? I'm using it as a tool to create distance. The difficulty with the how long and the why questions is that they can bring you in closer relationship. This is how one New Testament scholar quoted it, and I love it. Those questions can bring you closer, or they can push you away. Right? When I started talking with Kendra about Thanksgiving, I began asking how long because she was my safe person and I wanted to connect with her. Like, just, hey, me and you, we're on a team. I'm waiting to eat, but I trust you. Connect with me. How much longer do we think? But when I started to ask why, and I was physically in the corner, like stuffing bread in my mouth without any butter, and I was creating physical distance between my family, the questions were creating relational distance. It was creating a gap. There's a power to these verses because it gives us permission to ask God the hard questions, but there is a pause to say when you ask them, be careful that you're bringing yourself closer to him, not driving yourself farther away from him, and how do we make sure that we do that? That's the question. That's the teaching. That's where God begins to speak. He hears the questions from Habakkuk. He validates the questions. He doesn't correct him for asking the questions, but then he responds to them and says, look, you've been looking around at Israel. I want you to look at the nations. And I'm going to give you something that's going to be hard for you to swallow. I'll say it just verbatim. Look at the nations and watch. Be utterly amazed. I'm going to do something in your days that you're not going to believe, even if I told you. If there's a phrase that I could have you sit with for Advent, for this series, but especially for this day, it's this: in troubled times. When we're looking for God to bring objective justice, to fix what's wrong, in troubled times, God's justice is a journey. I'm going to unpack that a little bit. But in troubled times, God's justice is a journey. He brings justice. He responds to the prayer of how long and why, but his response is more of a process. It's more of a journey rather than a single event. And that's what you hear in these verses. He says, look, I'm going to raise up these Babylonians. And those Babylonians are going to come and invade Jerusalem. And that's going to be my response to your problem with this culture falling apart. I'm going to take them to their natural conclusion. They're resisting God's law. I'm going to bring a group of people that have no idea what God's law is, and they're going to invade and conquer. Prayer answered. What would you say? Habakkuk was like, God, I love you. You're my guy. You're my rock. Are you nuts? That's a loose translation of verse 13. But it's in there. Did you hear him? He says in verse 12, after he was just told that this country is going to invade and completely eradicate God's people, sweep them away as slaves, he says in verse 12, Lord, are you not eternal? Are you not bigger than any other false god out there? You're my guy. You're my holy one. You're going to never die. And then he says in verse 13, you're too pure to look on evil. Why are you tolerating people who are worse than us? I don't understand. God said, I told you weren't going to understand. Do you hear that tension in these passages? How long and why? I'll tell you, but you're not going to understand. Tell him. I don't understand. So what do we learn from this? What's the journey? What we need to do to guard ourselves is make sure we follow the invitation of this passage. It's going to challenge us as believers to do a couple of things. One, to think more globally than just on our own selves. God's justice that he is bringing, God's story, God's action in these verses is bigger than Israel. That's why he says, look out to the nations. Don't just focus on your own country, Habakkuk. Realize that I'm at work in the world. You know, the average Christian right now, if you just kind of do a study, there's like 2.5 billion people that claim to be Christians in the world. So if that number was 100, 66 of them would not be from Europe or North America. So the way one of our friends, Kendra and our friends who studies global Christianity at our seminary said, the average Christian is a mid 30s to mid 50s female, non-white, who daily feels a threat to her safety, lives in either the global south, Africa or Asia, and has very little income or means. That's what the average Christian looks like. Now, most of us, when we think about the state of the church, we think about the state of the American church. This passage would challenge us to say, when we ask, God, what are you doing in the world? Remember that he's at work in the world. And then, as we're challenged to think more globally, to be a member of the global body of believers, this passage says, hold our expectations a little bit more loosely. The thing that God is doing with Babylon doesn't make sense in a snapshot, but it makes sense as a bigger picture. The other night I was walking with my daughter. I've got 1-year-old daughters, and we do a glow stick walk at night. I think I told you about this. But we put the girls in these like little baby backpacks where they kind of hang. You've seen these? It's awesome. But Emmy, our littlest one, gets attached to a jingle bell. And she wants to hold it and shake it the whole walk, and it's really endearing. And so she was doing that last night, and we were shaking and jingling, and we heard everything. As long as we hear the jingle, we know that everything's fine. But there was a brief pause where we stopped hearing the jingle for a little bit, and then we started hearing it again, and both of her hands were empty. It's very suspicious. So then I looked at Kendra, and she goes, where did the bell go? Did it fall? And then we looked at a flashlight, shined it on Emmy, and she had almost swallowed it. And so we had ripped that thing out of her mouth as quickly as possible, did the parental finger scoop, which you kind of do and hope your hands were somewhat clean. And when we did, our 1-year-old daughter said, thank you for that act of compassion and justice. That was the right parental move. Right? Isn't that what she did? Of course. It was amazing. No, I'm pretty sure neighbors thought that we had amputated her left toe. I mean, she rage cried for like 15 minutes all the way back home because we had the audacity to rip something from hers that she justly deserved. In a moment, she couldn't understand that the most just thing that could have happened, the best thing, the right thing to happen was actually for her to lose that bell. As parents, we have a gap in perspective that she will never have until she becomes a parent herself. Y'all, if God is real, the gap between us and a kid is way smaller than God and us. And somehow, when we are living in troubled times, we tend to think, if I can't understand what God is doing, then he's not doing anything. This passage is a gentle reminder to say, sometimes God is at work. And we're never going to understand it. And God has the loving grace to tell Habakkuk, I'll tell you, but you're not going to know. So then we're left with this concluding thought. Right? We're in troubled times. We see God's ways not followed. We're struggling. We ask how long and why. And then we're trying to hold loosely the expectations of what God is doing so that we don't really understand. It feels like, God, you're inviting us to say, what are you doing? And then you're asking us to trust that we're not going to get an answer. What do we do with that? I skipped the best two verses. After God describing the Babylonians and all of the craziness that they're going to do to invade Israel, he describes them as a guilty people who worship their own power. It's actually a condemnation of Babylon. It's this weird promise where he says, I'm going to use Babylon's own thirst for power as a tool for your discipline, and then I'm going to discipline them for their own issues. I'm going to deal with them later. This is such the parental move. I'm going to talk about you first, and I'll deal with your brother later, right? This is what God is saying. I'm going to deal with you, and this is what's happening for you. I want you to focus on you, and then I need you to trust that I will deal with justice for Babylon later. Chapter 2 is going to give us that answer. And then what Habakkuk says in response is, you know what, Lord? You're right. You're my God. You're my rock. You're consistent. And I see that you've sent Babylon for my discipline. And I still don't get why you're doing it. And there's this beautiful tension there. And it doesn't get resolved in Habakkuk. But what I love about this passage is it's somehow pointing us towards this season of Advent, this season of coming. God was asking Habakkuk, trust that the coming of Babylon is going to be an act of justice, an act of making things right, even though it feels like an injustice. And then a couple hundred years later, Paul is a church planter, a follower of Jesus, and he's talking to a group of people, and he's describing the whole history of the church, and he quotes this verse. He says, look, you think that the coming of God was going to be this first act of sweeping judgment against everybody but you. But just like it was back in Habakkuk, it's going to be this. It was the same way now. God had to first come and deal with your injustice before he dealt with the injustice of the world around you. He had to deal with your sin and your selfishness and your issues before he fought for you on the stuff that was done and imposed on you. God's justice, God's journey of justice happens to us. And then it fights for us. And what's wonderful is that in that verse, it's Acts 13, you can read it later, it describes Jesus almost like a true and better Babylon, where Jesus is the final answer to our cries of how long and why. He's the final solution that God brings, and he doesn't come conquering. He comes to be conquered. The first coming of Jesus, the first Advent, the reason we celebrate Christmas is because the ultimate solution to troubled times is a parent who says it's not right and your heart is so hard and there's no law that's going to force you to start obeying my ways and embrace this beautiful life. I've got to do something that the law can't do. I've got to do something that only a relationship and only love can do. I'm going to sacrifice myself for you, my kids. So God becomes a baby and lives a life of oppression and poverty and mercy and justice and willingly allows himself to be killed by the very Jewish people that he was coming to save. And then through their rejection, the world realizes he didn't just come for Jewish folks, he came for everybody. And when he died on the cross, it was an act of justice. This is the punishment for sin, and it was an act of mercy. It was the payment for sin. The cross is God's solution, where he doesn't give an answer to why and how long. He gives an invitation to relationship and says, I'll be your God, and I'll come again a second time, and I will eliminate everything sad. I will eliminate everything wrong. I will make everything right. But the first thing I need to do is solve your heart, because if I just come like Babylon, everybody is going to be wrecked. If I just come as an executor of justice, no one will survive. I have to come with justice mixed with mercy, and that's why I'm going to come and die on the cross the first time. And that's why as Christians, we celebrate this every single year. Because we need to reignite our longing for a Savior and a just King who makes all things new. I don't know where you are. I don't know what aspect of troubled times is hurting you. But what the invitation of this passage is to say, if there is a guy, if there's a parent, if there is a God who is willing to let me conquer him so that I might be broken free from the slavery that I am holding on to willingly, then maybe I can let go of the life that he's asking me to embrace. Maybe he loves me more than I can imagine. There's a relationship there that I want to be a part of. Maybe the coming of Jesus is a good thing that I can long for. I don't have to know where the journey ends. I don't have to know the next 15 steps of the journey. I just need to know who's driving.